good morning to all of you. As Derek said, my name is Jeff Allen, President and CEO of Friends of Cancer Research. In recent months, there have been tremendous and necessary focus on the critical need for diversifying clinical trials, not only for areas such as the COVID-19 vaccines that we've heard so much about, but for all drug trials across the board. The barriers to advancing this diversity in clinical trials are indeed complex, but it's imperative that all of us within the research community come together in order to meet this challenge. For this reason, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Adamson, the Global Head of Oncology Development and Pediatric Innovation at Sanofi, to share his thoughts on the challenge and imperative of achieving diversity in clinical trials. In addition to his work at Sanofi, Dr. Adamson is a Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics at the Penn School of Medicine. He's been an investigator of pediatric oncology at the NCI, and his research is focused on pediatric drug development, especially early phase trials, for clinical and pharmacologic studies. Thanks, Dr. Adamson, for joining us today, and I'd like to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a real honor to be here on this third day of what I know has been a very exciting set of meetings. Want to share a little bit about what we're doing at Sanofi to increase inclusion and diversity, and as well as share some perspective, but to quickly, I think, reorient everyone as to the magnitude of the challenge. This is data on the racial and ethnic diversity in oncology clinical trials. This is a subset of trials that are patients enrolled in FDA drug approvals. And as you can see, between 2008 and 2018, Blacks, as well as other minorities, are significantly underrepresented. And what I would like to highlight on this slide is not only are we well below the 13+% of Blacks who comprise our population in the United States, but the curve is flat. Despite this having been an important area, we have not made the progress we need. And the impact of our failure to make this progress, I think, is playing out in a number of arenas. If we look at the impact of race and ethnicity on cancer incidence, there are cancers that we know, such as prostate cancers, where the incidence is significantly higher amongst Blacks than amongst whites. And there are cancers where the incidence is the same, such as breast cancer. Independent of what we do know about this diversity is reflected in the outcome of our current treatments. So when one looks at prostate cancer, where there's a significantly higher incidence, Blacks unfortunately have a worse outcome. It's significantly even more dramatic for women with breast cancer, who are well behind what we would expect at this day and age. Part of the reason, I think many of us believe, is our failure to include a diverse population in our clinical trials. That inclusion really is the first step to unlocking why the outcomes may be different. What are the biological factors? What are the other factors? And when we don't include a diverse population, we fall further and further behind. So right before I joined Sanofi a year and a half ago, a policy position was published, and it states what should be obvious, but I think it's important to highlight the three aspects. At Sanofi, as well, I would say, all of the private sector, we should be testing our treatments in the patient populations that they are intended to help. All individuals should have the opportunity to be included in clinical trials, particularly people from diverse populations who are often underrepresented in clinical research. And lastly, we have a responsibility to recognize and to seek to understand any differential in efficacy or safety within diverse populations, guided by evolving scientific understanding. That policy has taken hold, and we are now at a time where we are taking many steps to implement what we need to do to realize this policy. One of those steps occurred earlier this year, where the Sanofi Advocacy Council was constituted. About 70 prominent external stakeholders were asked to discuss the challenges of diversity and inclusion. And these groups included many, many leading cancer advocacy organizations. Shown on the right are 5 of the areas that rose to the top. These are not all the areas that rose. arose, but these were the 5 leading ones. Lack of patient awareness and education at the top. Distrust and negative perceptions. This continues today. You can trace it back to Tuskegee, you can go before then, but distrust and negative perceptions are still a major barrier. Low access to clinical trial locations. We need to think about ways not to bring patients to trials, but to bring trials to patients if we want to solve this. Our protocols do not facilitate diversity, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. And a challenge, I think, for the whole field, particularly in the subspecialties, particularly oncology, we have a lack of diversity of investigators as well as in trial recruiters. We need to build our pipeline of a diverse population of oncologists, of clinical scientists, of investigators, if we're going to make headway here. One of the challenge is how to benchmark. And even this, surprisingly, is a challenge for us. So when one looks at the demographics of diseases within the United States, the SEER database is central to what we do. And we have estimates of prevalence by race. But, and this is an example from patients with metastatic breast cancer, other databases don't fully align with this. And you can go to many different databases and you might end up with different benchmarks. What I think this points to is the increasing importance of programs from the NCI that include the SEER program. Right now, I believe SEER represents almost 50% of the population. We need good data, we need good benchmarks to see if we are in fact doing what we intend to do and making progress. This was an important paper by Dr. Unger from the Fred Hutch, along with folks from the American Cancer Society, from the NCI, that looked at 4 of the barrier domains, structural, clinical, physician, and patient, that shows the effect of these barriers to participation. When one begins at the structural, almost half of patients, there's simply no trial available. After that, and this is something I will again return to, a significant fraction of patients are found to be ineligible. For those patients who are eligible, there are barriers where the physician, whether they have time or the ability or the knowledge to offer that discussion and ultimately get enrolled. But you can see, and this actually did somewhat surprise me, that this study estimated 8% of patients participating in clinical trials. We've heard estimates that are lower. But let me turn back to what I think is the low-hanging fruit, and that is patient eligibility, because we who conduct clinical research, we control that. We can determine who's eligible and who's not. And there's a dramatic fall off in whether there's a trial available and who can participate. As Jeff mentioned, in my prior life, I was honored to lead the Children's Oncology Group, a group funded by the NCI. And last year, in a collaboration with a European pediatric oncology group, we published the results of a global trial looking at a targeted therapy in patients with a rare pediatric lymphoma. And I want to just highlight how my thinking in part has been influenced by caring for patients with rare cancers in the past. So this was a study in patients with high-risk mature B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the reason I bring it up is this disease, and it's primarily Burkitt's lymphoma in children, is a rapidly growing cancer. And you can see in the lower right where the triangle is, children present with a large abdominal mass, displacing bowel to one side, quickly filling the abdomen. And what is perhaps most frightening about this cancer is that this is perhaps the fastest growing cancer that exists. So when we're caring for these children, from day to day, you can actually see this tumor growing. And so the imperative when a child presents with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, such as Burkitt's lymphoma, is to quickly arrive at the diagnosis, metabolically stabilize those patients, and then start treatment. And it's on this background of a very compressed workup starting treatment that we actually conduct clinical research. And one of the reasons we've been able to do that is we recognize that we need to be able to include essentially all patients with Burkitt's lymphoma. We don't have the luxury of time of starting to work our way through eligibility criteria. So let me just highlight two parts of this paper that drive home this point. So in the red box are the eligibility criteria. It's essentially one sentence. It basically says, does the child have advanced stage mature B-cell lymphoma? And if the answer is yes, and you've confirmed that with pathology, they're eligible. But of course, there's always more devil in the details, and this paper in the New England Journal refers to the appendix. And when you go to the appendix, it's still one paragraph. And I draw your attention to the last sentence. There are no exclusion criteria based on organ function. We recommend dose guidelines for patients who do have dysfunction. So what this study says is that we know that no matter what, when a child comes in with Burkitt's lymphoma, we have to treat that child. And so why exclude any of the children we have to treat? Now, there were some exclusions because there was an investigational drug involved, but they were minimal. So when it comes to saying, can you make an impact on eligibility? I will tell you, you absolutely can. That's not to imply that first in human trials have to have a widely available eligibility criteria. By the time you get to phase 3, you really want to be studying your drug, your intervention in as broad a population as possible. And having done this for many years, what I can say is eligibility criteria in our protocols have evolved over time. And unfortunately, what I'll say is they've evolved without Darwinian forces. We never take anything away. We just add on to eligibility criteria. But we can make an impact here because we control this. We can make these changes today. We can defend these changes to IRBs, to regulatory authorities. Everyone is prepared. We have to do this. But it's turning a big ship. But this is the low-hanging fruit, and it's addressing an important, but still relatively small part of our challenge. So what are we doing? Well, let me share with you our ambition. We clearly have to increase our understanding. We have to better understand disease and patient demographics, their comorbidities. We have to understand the healthcare journey. What do patients with cancer go through? What prevents them from getting into a clinical trial? As part of that, behavioral science. We need to apply behavioral science. We have to find better ways to address the understandable fear and mistrust that has evolved, to work on adherence, health system access, socioeconomics. We can apply science, but we need to do this. And we have to look at the support system. What does this mean on the right? We have to change the way we work. We have to establish early understanding of what patients experience, what they need. As I mentioned, we have to design our trials for inclusion. We have to understand how our trials interface with what a patient is going through. We need to engage with the community. We have to understand what are the barriers to awareness. We have to improve education, and we have to work collaboratively in our research programs. Where have we started? I think I paused my screen sharing there. I apologize. Let me see if I can get it moving again. I'm going to stop sharing for, oh, there it is. Hopefully there. Sorry about that. So what are we doing to address the challenges? We're just starting, but we're taking concrete actions. What are our trial designs? We have to make sure we implemented diversity. We have to understand and ask questions about it. Our trial sites, we need to understand where the patients are. We have to bring our trials to the patients. We have ways to map this. We have to improve training, right? People need the tools, whether there are CRAs, whether they're investigators, of the importance of diversity and inclusion. We have to reach out to the community, engage the community, and we need to bring technology to this problem. Fortunately, many people are focused on this. And What I would say, certainly at Sanofi, and I know for most of my industry colleagues, we need to be committed and be a part of the solution. We're the largest funders of medical research. We have to be there. We are fortunate to be able to work with the NCI and the NIH, to be able to work with groups such as Friends of Cancer Research, with academic societies. I think this is an important time in our history. We need to be able to come together. I know a little bit later today, there's a whole panel on diversity. We certainly believe diversity as a fact and inclusion as an act. And I'm excited to be at a company that is committed to addressing this. And I'm even more excited and optimistic to be working for the many people who are committed to improving the outcome. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate your perspective and highlighting a critical issue that I know will be woven throughout our discussion as we transition into topics today.